The forest was the only place Ilara's silence felt like a gift, not a curse. In the suffocating quiet of St. Jude's orphanage, her muteness was a void that the other children filled with taunts and the matrons with impatient sighs. But out here, under the canopy of whispering pines and sun-dappled oaks, her silence allowed her to become part of the woods. She could hear the skittering of a squirrel long before it appeared, the subtle shift in the wind that promised rain, and the gentle hum of life that the loud world always missed. Today, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden fingers through the trees, painting the forest floor in stripes of light and shadow. Ilara, her bare feet deft on the mossy ground, was tracking the flight of a blue jay when a sound broke the natural harmony. It was a low, guttural groan, thick with pain, a sound that did not belong to any animal she knew. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in her silent world. Her first instinct, honed by years of avoiding trouble, was to flee back to the dubious safety of the orphanage. But a deeper, more primal curiosity pulled her forward. She moved with the caution of a doe, slipping between ancient tree trunks, her eyes wide as she scanned the dense undergrowth. She found him slumped against the base of a massive redwood, half hidden by ferns. His face, etched with lines of sun and hardship, was pale and beaded with sweat, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes were closed, but as another wave of pain washed over him, his hand twitched, reaching for a wound she now clearly saw was from a bullet. Fear warred with a sudden, aching wave of compassion. He was dying. She could see it in the waxy pallor of his skin and the faint, rasping sound of his breath. The sun was dipping lower, bleeding orange and purple into the sky, and a chill was beginning to snake through the air. To leave him here was to condemn him to death by cold and blood loss. But what could she do? She was a girl of 12, with no voice to call for help and no strength to carry him. The town was miles away, and even if she could run that far, who would listen? They would see a frantic, mute orphan, and her gestures would be dismissed as childish fantasy. No one ever truly listened to Ilara. He groaned again, a sound of pure agony, and his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they focused on her, clouded with pain, but holding a flicker of awareness. In that gaze, she saw not a threat, but a desperate plea. It was a language she understood perfectly. Her decision was made in the silent space of a single heartbeat. Steeling herself, Ilara knelt beside him. Her hands, though trembling, were steady as she reached for the hem of her worn calico dress. With a determined rip, she tore a long strip of fabric, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. The dying rancher watched her, his breath hitching, as she leaned in to press the makeshift bandage against his wound. The Montana air, crisp and pine-scented by day, turned sharp and unforgiving as the last vestiges of twilight vanished. A bone-deep chill seeped through Ilara's thin cotton dress, a stark reminder of her own vulnerability. The man beside her, a heavy, motionless form in the gloom, began to shiver violently. His breathing was shallow, a ragged sound that seemed to be swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. The makeshift bandage on his side was dark with blood, and she knew that pressure alone wouldn't save him from the cold. Fear, cold and sharp as an icicle, pricked at her, but another feeling pushed it back, a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. His life was a flickering flame, and she was the only one there to shield it from the wind. Her mind, accustomed to the quiet observation of the woods, raced through its catalogue of survival knowledge. Warmth. He needed warmth. She moved with a quiet urgency, her small hands gathering piles of dry leaves and fallen pine needles. She worked methodically, piling the debris over his body, creating a fragile, insulating mound. She tucked the edges around him, trying to trap what little body heat he had left. His shivering subsided slightly, a small victory that fueled her determination. Next, water. His lips were cracked and pale. She remembered a small, clear stream not far from her hiding spot. Guided by the faint moonlight filtering through the dense canopy, she navigated the familiar terrain. She cupped her hands, the icy water a shock to her skin, and carefully carried the precious mouthfuls back to him. He was barely conscious, but when she gently tilted his head and let the water trickle onto his lips, he reflexively swallowed. She made several trips, her own thirst a distant ache. On one return, his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. He tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. "Sarah, he mumbled, his words dissolving into a pained groan before his eyes slid shut again. The name hung in the air, a fragment of a life she couldn't comprehend, but she stored it away. It was a piece of him, a reason to fight harder. An owl hooted from a high branch, its call echoing through the darkness, and a rustle in the underbrush made her freeze, her heart pounding against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a predator. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a guardian, standing vigil over a life that was not her own. She huddled closer to the man, sharing her meager warmth, her small frame a defiant shield against the vast, indifferent night. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to fracture the darkness in the east, Ilara was exhausted, cold and terrified, but the rancher's chest still rose and fell. He was still alive. The first rays of dawn were merciless, painting the sky in hues of pale pink and orange, but offering no real warmth. They illuminated Ilara's exhaustion, carving dark circles under her eyes. The cold of the night had been a fierce, immediate enemy, but the morning brought a slower, more insidious threat: time. Every passing minute was a grain of sand slipping through her fingers, taking the rancher's life with it. She crawled closer to him, her own limbs stiff and aching. She placed a hand on his forehead. It was burning. A fever had taken hold, a testament to the infection brewing beneath the crude bandage. Peeling back a corner of the cloth she'd torn from her dress, her stomach churned at the sight. The skin around the wound was an angry, inflamed red, puffy and hot. Her desperate efforts had kept him from bleeding out, but they couldn't stop the poison spreading through him. He needed a doctor. He needed medicine she couldn't conjure from leaves and stream water. A terrible conflict raged within her. The thought of leaving him here, vulnerable and alone, was paralyzing. The woods, which had been her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. But the image of his feverish, dying face was a more powerful torment. He would die here if she stayed. He might live if she left. Her gaze fell to his worn denim jacket. He was a person, with a life and a home somewhere beyond these trees. Maybe there was a clue. Overcoming a wave of guilt for invading his privacy, she slid her small, trembling fingers into his breast pocket. They closed around a hard, rectangular object. She pulled out a thick leather wallet, cracked and softened with age. With clumsy, cold-numbed hands, she opened it. The first thing she saw was a driver's license tucked into a plastic sleeve. The name read Caleb Thorne. The address listed was Thorn Creek Ranch, Upsaroka County. Caleb. He had a name. Behind the license was a photograph. Its colors faded from years of being carried. A woman with a kind smile stood with her arm around a young girl with bright, laughing eyes. The girl couldn't have been much older than Ilara herself. Was this Sarah? The name he'd whispered in his delirium. The sight of that photo changed everything. He wasn't just a wounded stranger anymore. He was Caleb Thorne, a father, a husband. He belonged to someone. He belonged to that little girl with the laughing eyes. A fierce, protective determination surged through Ilara, chasing away the last vestiges of her fear. She had to save him, for them. She carefully tucked the wallet back into his pocket, her movements now filled with purpose. She took her handkerchief, dipped it in the last of the water from the tin cup, and gently dabbed his cracked lips. It was a small, inadequate gesture, but it was all she had left to give. Leaning close, she made a silent vow, a promise that resonated not in sound, but in the sheer force of her will. I'll be back. With one last look at his still form, she turned and ran. Her small legs pumped, carrying her away from the man she'd fought all night to save, and into the vast, indifferent wilderness. She didn't know how far Thorn Creek Ranch was, or if she could even find it. All she knew was that she had to try. The wilderness was a relentless adversary, Ilara ran, her small legs pumping, fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and a desperate silent prayer. The leather wallet, tucked safely into the pocket of her worn dress, felt like both a lead weight pulling her down and a sacred talisman pushing her forward. Every time the burning in her lungs became unbearable and her muscles screamed for rest, the image of the smiling family, Caleb, a woman with kind eyes, and two small children, flashed in her mind. It was a promise she had made to a man who couldn't hear it, from a girl who couldn't speak it. She pushed through dense undergrowth, thorny branches snagging the thin fabric of her dress and leaving angry red scratches on her arms and face. The crisp Montana morning air, which usually felt invigorating on her short escapes from the orphanage, was now a harsh razor against her raw throat. She stumbled over exposed roots and slippery rocks, her worn-out shoes offering little protection against the unforgiving ground. The forest was a dizzying labyrinth of towering pines and whispering aspens, their sameness disorienting. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her resolve. Was she even going in the right direction? She had no map, only a desperate hope, and the sun climbing higher in the eastern sky as her compass. Hours bled into one another. The initial frantic sprint had long since faded into a grueling, staggering jog. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a hollow ache that mirrored the profound emptiness of her silent world. Thirst was a constant torment, her tongue thick and dry, her throat raw from gasping for air. She paused once, collapsing by a small, clear stream to gulp down handfuls of icy water that shocked her system. As she knelt there, shivering, she pulled out the wallet again. She traced the faded image of the woman Caleb had called Sarah. A single, hot tear escaped Ilara's eye, mingling with the cold water on her cheek. She wasn't just saving a stranger. She was fighting to return a husband and a father to his home. With a surge of renewed determination, she pushed herself back to her feet. The terrain began to change, the dense woods thinning out, giving way to rolling foothills and vast, open meadows dotted with grazing cattle. It looked like ranch country. Hope, fragile but fierce, surged through her exhausted body. She pushed harder, her breath coming in ragged, soundless gasps, her vision starting to blur at the edges. And then she saw it. A weathered wooden archway over a dirt road, with two words carved deep into the overhead beam, Thorne Creek. Beyond it, a long, dusty road snaked its way toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. Relief washed over her so intensely it felt like a physical blow, making her knees buckle. She had made it. She stumbled forward, her eyes fixed on the distant ranch house. She had to reach them. She had to make them understand. But her body had nothing left to give. The world began to spin, the bright blue sky tilting and swirling into the brown earth. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed in a heap on the dusty track just inside the ranch's entrance. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the figure of a man on horseback, his silhouette stark against the sun, galloping towards her. Jake was checking the northern fence line when he saw it, a small, crumpled heap just inside the main gate. From a distance, it looked like a pile of discarded rags. As he rode closer, the shape resolved into a person, a child. His hand instinctively went to the rifle holstered on his saddle, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Strangers on Thorne land were rare and rarely a good sign. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel, the midday Montana sun beating down on his neck. The girl was unconscious, her face smudged with dirt and tears, her dress torn and stained with what looked ominously like dried blood. Then he saw what she was clutching in her small hand, held to her chest like a sacred relic. It was a worn leather wallet, Caleb's wallet. Jake's blood ran cold. He knelt, his rough hands gentle as he pried the wallet free. It was Caleb's, no doubt about it. The sight of it in this strange girl's hand, combined with her exhausted and battered state, painted a terrifying picture. He scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing. Spurring his horse into a gallop, he raced toward the ranch house, his mind a storm of worst-case scenarios. Sarah. he bellowed as he thundered into the yard. Sarah Thorne appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, a question on her face that melted into confusion, then stark terror. She saw the unconscious child in Jake's arms, then the familiar wallet he held up. A choked sob escaped her lips. "Oh God, Jake, what happened?" They laid Ilara on the living room sofa. Sarah pressed a damp cloth to the girl's forehead, her hands trembling. When Ilara's eyes fluttered open, they were wide with panic, darting between the anxious faces of Sarah and Jake. She tried to speak, to explain, but only a frustrated, silent gasp came out. Tears welled in her eyes as the old, familiar helplessness washed over her. "It's okay, honey, it's okay," Sarah soothed, though her own voice was strained with fear. "Can you show us, where is he? Where is my Caleb?" Ilara pushed herself up, her weak body trembling. She pointed frantically toward the window, toward the vast expanse of forest, her gestures becoming more desperate. "The map," Jake said suddenly. "Get the big property map." Sarah scrambled to retrieve a large, rolled-up map from her husband's office. She spread it across the floor. Without hesitation, Ilara slid off the sofa and crawled towards it. With a shaky finger, she traced a path from the edge of the sun. Jude's property deep into the woods, finally stabbing her finger down on a specific point, a rugged ravine by an old, dried-up creek bed. She looked up at Sarah, her eyes pleading, conveying all the urgency her voice could not. In that moment, Sarah's fear crystallized into steely resolve. She looked at Jake, her expression now hard as flint. "Get every man. Tell them to bring horses, supplies, and their rifles. I'm calling Sheriff Brody." Now, the convoy of ranch trucks and Sheriff Brody's patrol vehicle kicked up a trail of dust that hung in the afternoon air. Ilara sat in the passenger seat of the sheriff's truck, a thick wool blanket draped over her small shoulders. Her exhaustion was a physical weight, but her eyes were fixed on the tree line ahead, a dark, impenetrable wall they were about to breach. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of long years and hard decisions, occasionally glanced at her. He'd seen a lot in his time, but a silent, shoeless child leading a posse of 40 hardened men was a first. He'd been skeptical, but the raw, unwavering certainty in her eyes when she'd pointed to that spot on the map had silenced his doubts. They drove as far as the rugged logging trail would allow before the path dissolved into the untamed wilderness of the Montana backcountry. Doors slammed, and the low murmur of voices was punctuated by the jingle of harnesses as the men on horseback prepared to lead the way. "All right, folks, listen up," Brody's voice cut through the noise. "We stick together. Jake, you and your boys know this land. You follow the girl's lead." Ilara slid out of the truck, her bare feet sinking into the soft pine needles. She didn't hesitate. She pointed toward a barely visible game trail, her small hand steady. Jake gave a curt nod, his expression a mixture of concern and growing admiration for the child. "You heard him. Let's move." The trek was brutal. They navigated steep inclines, littered with loose rocks, and pushed through dense thickets of alder that clawed at their clothes. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, menacing shadows that shifted and danced like specters. For the men, it was a physically demanding march. For Ilara, it was a test of sheer will. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but the image of Caleb's pale face and the photograph of his smiling family fueled her steps. She moved with a purpose that belied her frail frame, her memory of the path unerring. An hour bled into 2. The initial chatter of the men faded into the heavy sounds of labored breathing and the crunch of boots on the forest floor. They watched her, this wisp of a girl, and their respect grew with every determined step she took. She was their compass, their only hope. Brody walked near her, his initial skepticism now fully transformed into a protective watchfulness. He saw the grim determination etched on her face and recognized it as the same look he'd seen on soldiers and smoke jumpers, the look of someone who would not quit, no matter the cost. Suddenly, Ilara stopped. The entire procession halted behind her. The air grew still, thick with anticipation. She raised a trembling arm and pointed downward, into a shadowed ravine choked with ferns and fallen logs. Her eyes, wide and haunted, met Sheriff Brody's. No words were needed. He moved to the edge, peering down. Jake and the others crowded behind him. Below, nestled against the base of a large ponderosa pine, was a crude shelter of branches and leaves. A patch of dark, disturbed earth was visible nearby. It was exactly as she must have left it. "Hold here," Brody commanded in a low voice. He and Jake began their careful descent into the ravine, their hearts pounding in their chests. The fate of Caleb Thorne lay just feet below. Sheriff Brody and Jake were the first to scramble down the loose scree into the ravine, their boots dislodging pebbles that skittered into the growing twilight. Caleb lay exactly where Ilara had left him, pale and dangerously still. Brody knelt, pressing 2 fingers against Caleb's neck, a faint, thready pulse. "He's alive," the sheriff announced, his voice a low rumble of authority that cut through the tension. "Barely. Let's move, people. We're losing the light and we're losing him." With practiced efficiency, the men fashioned a stretcher from 2 sturdy pine branches and a pair of canvas coats. The extraction was a tense, coordinated effort, a slow and careful ascent from the ravine's shadowed embrace. Ilara watched from the ridge, a small, silent figure wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her knuckles white as she gripped the coarse wool. She followed the grim procession back through the darkening woods, the rhythmic crunch of boots on pine needles a solemn drumbeat marking their progress. Lantern lights spilled from the ranch house porch as they emerged from the tree line. Sarah met them on the steps, her face a mask of controlled terror and hope. She didn't cry out. Instead, she walked alongside the stretcher as they carried it inside, her hand finding Caleb's, her touch a desperate anchor. "I'm here, Caleb," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm here." They laid him on the large bed in the master bedroom, the clean sheets a stark contrast to his dirt-caked clothes. The town doctor, who'd arrived just minutes before, immediately went to work, cutting away the blood-stiffened fabric around the wound. As he cleaned the injury, Caleb's eyelids fluttered. He looked vaguely around the room, his gaze unfocused until it landed on the sheriff. "Henderson," he rasped, the name a mere puff of air. "The fence line," he said the creek was his. His eyes slid shut again, but Brody had heard enough. It was the lead he needed. Hours later, the house had settled into a quiet vigil. The doctor confirmed the bullet had passed through, and while the infection was severe, Caleb would likely pull through. Ilara sat curled in a large armchair in the living room, a mug of cold cocoa resting in her hands. She felt adrift, her purpose fulfilled. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression softened by a profound, weary gratitude. She knelt before Ilara, taking the small, chapped hands in her own. "Ilara," she said softly, making sure to meet the girl's gaze, "there are no words to thank you. You saved my husband. You saved our family." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "I spoke with the orphanage. They understand. This is your home now if you'll have it. We want you here." Ilara looked from Sarah's earnest face toward the closed bedroom door, behind which the man she saved was fighting his way back to life. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the silence within her wasn't a void of loneliness, but a space of peace. A slow, hesitant nod was her answer. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, but for the first time, it wasn't a tear of sorrow, it was a tear of belonging.